Several years ago, I decided to delete all of my social media accounts. This was not long after the term doom scrolling entered our vocabulary. For those who don't know, doom scrolling is the habit of endlessly consuming bad news, each headline fueling the need to find another. Now, you would think that deleting social media altogether would stop one from participating in this endless cycle of consuming bad news, but oh no, not for me. Your pastor is far too resourceful for something like that. I managed to invent an all-new form of perpetual hopelessness that I call doom refreshing. Most days, I refresh and refresh and refresh various news websites so that I can keep reading more and more stories of the world's ongoing spiral into despair. Do you ever doom scroll or doom refresh like me? Even without these skills, I'm guessing you felt a little desperate or demoralized by the state of things lately. And I mean, how could you not? Our government is in the midst of a historically long shutdown because the only thing our leaders can agree on is that it's the other side's fault. Meanwhile, multiple major cities are caught in conflict, as one side claims that these cities are overrun with crime, and the other side claims that the national government shouldn't be involved in state affairs. And at the same time, the news shows footage every night from Ukraine and Gaza, images of families running for safety, children pulled from the rubble, and yet we still argue over who deserves compassion. You see, it's not just that things are terrible. It's that we're so divided we can't even agree on what's terrible anymore. That's a particular kind of despair. It's the kind of hopelessness that leaves you wondering if anyone actually cares at all. And as Christians, pray as we might, this confusion and despair is enough to leave us wondering at times if God even cares anymore. But this intense loss of heart isn't anything new. In fact, the disciples felt it as well. In our gospel reading this morning, Jesus begins by telling his disciples that they should pray always and not lose heart. You see, the disciples were expecting Jesus to be a Messiah who would overthrow Rome and restore Israel's glory. But nothing was happening. Rome was still ruling and oppressing people. Many were still suffering in the streets, and all the while, Jesus kept talking about dying in Jerusalem. And I'm sure for the disciples, this was more than a little discouraging. But then into that discouragement, Jesus says, "Let me tell you a story." And he starts by telling us about a judge who neither fears God nor respects people, which in those days were the two main requirements for being a judge. This is the same as saying there once was a lifeguard who was afraid of water, or there once was a dentist who refused to floss, or there once was a pastor who didn't like to listen to himself talk. And so, if that's not enough, on top of this unqualified judge, Jesus also introduces us to a widow, a woman who has no advocate or societal power, but what she lacks in status, she makes up for in grit. Apparently, she is the patron saint of customer service complaints. Every day, Jesus says, she shows up and demands to speak to the manager, and finally, the judge caves. Not because he's compassionate, but because he's afraid that the widow is going to hurt him. This is the story that Jesus offers to disciples who are losing hope. Are you caught in an endless cycle of doom scrolling? Are you marinating in existential dread? No problem, Jesus says. Let me tell you about Honorable Judge Stoneheart and Madam Never Going Away. At first, this seems more than a little unhelpful. But notice how this strange story actually speaks to the very depths of human hopelessness. I think Jesus tells this confusing story because he knows that this is how faith often feels: confusing, unsettling, perplexing. Several years ago, I had a friend who was in a moment of deep crisis, and I prayed constantly for him, but nothing seemed to change. No advice I offered, no logical reframing could help pull him out of his depression. And so I kept taking his phone calls at all hours of the night, but slowly I noticed that his despair was becoming my despair as well. I remember praying, "Isn't this enough, God? Hasn't he been through enough?" I was starting to wonder if God was any better than that unjust judge in the parable. And when that thought starts to sneak in that maybe God doesn't care anymore, it's a particular kind of despair. Because it leaves you believing that it's all up to you, that we're just in this alone. I'm trying to help my friend here, God, but I've got nothing left, and if you're not going to pull him out of this, I really don't know what else I can do. Unfortunately, I know that I'm not the only one who's found myself in a situation like this. I'm lucky enough to report that my friend did make it through, and he's doing much better today. But I also know that that's not always how these stories play out. And Jesus' parable seems to suggest that the solution is just to be persistent, like the widow. At least that's what it sounds like at first, that if we just nag God enough, God will eventually give in and give us what we want. But that doesn't make any sense either. As a pastor, I carry far too many stories of people who begged for reconciliation that never came, or people who pleaded for another road to open that never did, or people who prayed for healing that never arrived. So what are we to believe about despair like that? Jesus ends his parable by asking, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? And I think that's really the heart of what this is all about. Jesus is asking the disciples who are losing hope if they will still trust God when the silence is deafening. And as hard of a question as that is to confront, the truth is that Jesus wouldn't ask it if he wasn't already willing to bring salvation directly into that difficult space. Because the truth is that our faith is built on the belief that Jesus didn't just tell stories, he entered our story. Your story of fear or heartbreak or loss. Your awful story that leaves you wondering whether God even cares. Our faith says that that is where God still meets us. I'll remind you that in the Garden of Gethsemane, the scriptures say that Jesus prayed intensely to God and said, "Take this cup from me," and that prayer went unanswered. Moments later, Jesus was betrayed and arrested, and the next day he cried out from the cross our own desperate question: my God, why have you forsaken me?" You see, this parable isn't about nagging God until we get what we want. It's about how Jesus gives us something to believe in when the world seems to be falling apart. Jesus is the one who persists despite all the despair. He's the one who keeps showing up day after day before the powers, demanding mercy for the poor and freedom for the captives and hope for the hopeless. The silence of Good Friday is not divine silence or absence. It's divine solidarity. Jesus lived inside the despair that so often haunts us. And through his death and resurrection, he redeems even that. He carries our hopelessness into death so that that hopelessness no longer owns us. That's what the resurrection means for us today. The same power that raised Jesus is already at work within these weary hearts of ours. And so the days may be often heavy, and we might find ourselves scrolling through endless bad news, but our faith urges us to trust that God is still at work in the despair and through us. Just as Jesus encounters us in our despair, we get to be the ones who show up for others in their suffering. Not to fix it or to solve it, but to be present in the struggle and thereby continue to bring the light of Christ into the shadows of this world. Later in worship, we will light candles for those who struggle with mental health ailments. And I'll light one, as I do every single year, for my friend, who is doing so much better, but who still has to fight against the darkness year after year. And these small flames that we light, they'll flicker like the screens we scroll through all week. But these candles still tell a story not of endless doom, but of a defiant hope. There are small lights of faith that dare to believe that God still will show up, just as we continue to show up with care and love for those in need around us. Because our faith proclaims that Jesus' love and presence has and will continue to persist.